What is right? I mean, I feel like this is a subjective word.
Making your pattern before you try to sew your costume is probably the right order.
You're so picky.
I guess improvisational sewing is not...
Improvisational sewing.
I like it. All right. Before we get to more fun things.
We should probably introduce ourselves, Ash, and do that part.
Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Ash.
I'm Al.
We are Lovey Cosplay.
And this is Shit Cosplayers Say. It is December of 2020. So, because we are recording very early, because we're trying to be proactive and not crunch our podcast.
Whatever that is.
Whatever that is. Proactive. I don't know what that means. We don't have any updates.
Currently, there's a convention going on in Dallas, Texas.
There is a convention going on in Dallas, Texas. We'll see how that goes.
Yep.
Maybe Texas is immune. I have no idea. I'm not quite sure what's up with that.
It'll be called Super Spreader Con.
Super Spreader. COVID
Con.
Yep, COVID Con. I don't know if it's a big enough con to be considered Super Spreader Con. But as you can tell, we are joined by some very special guests today.
Yes, we have two of our friends that we have met at one of the many quad cons that we've gone to in the past. Gentlemen, do you want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Scott Jordan, cognitive psychologist from Illinois State University, also known as Zombie Scotty, the host of Dark Loops Productions channel on YouTube.
I am Eric Wesselman, a social psychologist at Illinois State University. I don't have a cool moniker yet, still working on that. I'm one half of WGLT Site Geeks, Scott being the other half. And I also have a film blog called Film Culture, with cult all caps.
And we'll make sure that we put links to their shows and blogs in the notes so that you can find them, because you're going to want to. Because as we like to call them, the professors, as we often refer to them as, are incredibly enjoyable. Aww. And we always enjoy hanging out with them when we get the opportunity. And they've done some really cool things in the con community. Do you want to tell our friends a little bit about some of your adventures with being able to do some different speaking at different conventions?
Well, so as you mentioned, where we first met, QuadCon. I'm a Quad Cities, alumni. And so when I found out that there were these sort of fan-led cons in that area and reaching out into like Peoria, I think is where we met, I got really excited. I would have loved to have had those things when I was growing up. So I contribute whenever I can. Also gives me an excuse to head back to see my family. And so we do some panels there. And then we've also done panels at regional and even national conventions. I'll let Scott talk a little bit about those.
Hey, let's talk about the cool QuadCon stuff we've done recently. Eric's the one who has gotten us connected with QuadCon, and we got some panels. And Lord Bloodraw was at the con, and Eric invited him to join one of our panels, and it was probably one of my favorite panels. We had an absolute blast. Eric and I have actually participated in his virtual con earlier this year. Last year, when Eric and I were at QuadCon, we did this thing called Buckets of Blood. And and basically, people who asked questions during the panel picked a domino out of a jack-o'-lantern trick-or-treat bowl. And then we drew a domino at the end, and whoever won it won a book. Eric and I publish in a series called Sterling's Pop Culture Series, edited by Pop Culture Psychology, edited by Dr. Travis Langley. So we give one of those out after every gig to an audience member who participates, just because it's so fun. And then Eric and I started doing the con things we didn't start in 2015, but we met Dr. Travis Langley at WizardCon in Chicago in 2015. And we saw his book on display at that time, which was
Dark and Stormy Night.
Psychology, Dark and Stormy Night, right? So we looked at it, and then they were doing a panel on The Walking Dead, and we went to the panel, and it was legit psychology. And we said, okay, we went in, and he said, well, we're doing a book on Star Trek, but you need to have a chapter to us in 2 weeks. And we said, okay, we can do that. I can't speak for Eric. He can speak for himself on this. But for me, it's been a real nice full circle aspect to my career, starting off as a kid watching cartoons on Saturday morning when there were no such things as cons, and reading fantasy novels and comics and such. And the later years of my life, being able to bring that back to the stuff I love in psychology is incredibly rewarding and extremely satisfying. So, yeah.
And I know for your classes, you guys sometimes use some of these comic books and different fandom-esque materials to teach your classes as well, yes?
And Eric's done a whole class on X-Men, so I'll let him talk about that.
I would take all of Professor Eric's classes if I was at the university.
I've taught 2 classes on psychology and comics. One was just sort of a general, mostly superhero titles, although not exclusively. And I just kind of jumped around. And then recently I did one that was specifically focused on the X-Men universe. And so a lot of comics, but we also watched some of the different versions of the animated series. Yeah, pretty much. Very heavily the mid-90s one. But they did 6 episodes of Wolverine and the X-Men. We watched a couple episodes of the show The Gifted, which was a live-action adaptation of the X-Men universe on Fox, which was just absolutely phenomenal. It's one of the few things I've been binge-watched, and till the sun came up. And I've taught psychology and film. I've done a few little sort of mini classes for our honors program. I did one on Batman. I did one where we watched some anime. We focused on one class on Full Metal Alchemist. We did the All Is One episode, so that was fun.
Yes. Yeah, Eric and I taught at Senior Sem a few years ago, and I called it Wild Identities, and basically we went over some theory and science of identity, and then we applied it to pop culture phenomena. I had some grad students help me teach it, and one of them taught the students Princess Mononoke. They had them watch the movie together, and then students role-played the different characters to put themselves in different identities. And then next semester, I'm teaching a senior sem called Lovecraft Country, the psychology of identity, place, and trauma. And we're not going to focus just on the HBO series Lovecraft Country, but we're going to look at Lovecraft himself and what the Gothic meant, what Southern Gothic means, and how that relates to identity, place, and trauma. So it's very exciting to have everything come to this way. And one of the reasons we can do this is because pop culture is increasingly what I'll call discipline relevant. In other words, literature has always been discipline relevant, right? But when for the past 4 years, when you've wanted to find a good story, you haven't gone to the news, right? You've gone to good shows on television. Then that's because they're telling the best stories. For me, it's just a really cool time to be doing what I'm doing.
As you all have probably picked up on, the professors are definitely as geeky, if not more so, than we are. But they know their stuff.
I deny nothing.
They have more experience in being geeky than we do.
That's probably true.
That's just the miles. All right. It's not the age, it's the miles.
We have brought them on because they have a plethora of knowledge in relationship to psychosocial aspects of fandom. We've had quite a few conversations about the psychosocial aspects in regarding cosplay. And when we met up to figure out what we were going to talk about today, we realized we could probably talk for hours and hours and hours and hours because there's just so much to say. So for today, we settled on a topic that has been really difficult in the cosplay community, particularly during the pandemic. I've seen it get much, much worse than it was ever before. And that is the concept known as imposter syndrome, which Ash will tell you I deal with frequently. I'm very bad at this.
Yep.
I have a very large problem with imposter syndrome.
As do a lot of people that we know.
Yes. So I have found that the more talented a person, a lot of times the bigger the imposter syndrome issues. But the definition of this concept, which I believe I pulled from Wikipedia, because, why wouldn't you pull anything except for Wikipedia?
We can hang.
So imposter syndrome can be defined as a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist despite evident success. So an imposter in this case, so not imposter like among us. We're not being sus.
You are sus.
I am not sus. An imposter in this case is someone that suffers from chronic self-doubt and a sense of intellectual fraudulence that overrides any feelings of success or external proof of their competence. So a person who is competent but has a lot of self-doubt and is not confident themselves in what they are not able to do, which is basically a great definition of myself. So I will admit it.
We didn't tell you this was going to be a therapy session.
I'm used to providing the therapy.
We are not licensed.
I've gotten better over time.
Right.
I've gotten better over time. But imposter syndrome also, as I'm sure we know, tends to link into actual psychiatric conditions as well, like depression and anxiety. So, I've noticed that those that also have those conditions will typically have more of a struggle with this concept, depending on what's going on.
I'm really glad that you mentioned what we would call comorbid conditions, right? Because when you were giving us the definition of imposter syndrome, I thought, that's pretty diagnosable, right? It's pretty intense. My experience of using the concept is it's not quite as clinical. And I was glad that you mentioned the idea of depression and anxiety, because I would argue there's the phenomenon of imposter syndrome, which I can talk about later in terms of what I think it is neurologically. There are also other factors that can be part of who one is that would make that phenomenon of what we call imposter syndrome go in different ways than someone who may not have those comorbid conditions.
Yeah, we've definitely made no qualms about being honest that I have anxiety and depression issues at times, because to any community that you're in, any hobby that you have, anything that you do, those types of conditions affect how you do them and how you approach them.
Absolutely.
Especially with competing, that's always been kind of a hurdle. And I know that for a lot of people that I know that struggle with this concept of imposter syndrome do typically have a comorbidity of anxiety or depression, or ADHD is sometimes a struggle with this too, because you want to do A, but your brain's decided you're doing B. So although B is not very useful, that's what your brain's decided you're doing at this time. So you're going to scroll your phone for 2 hours instead of, cutting out that waistband that you need to for your skirt that's been sitting in your sewing room for a week.
Right.
Only a week?
Not me. No.
Oh, okay.
So this struggle is something that cosplayers talk about a lot, particularly right now when you're feeling this immense pressure to do, because you technically have more time, but due to that, right, but due to that collective trauma concept that is going on right now with a pandemic, technically you have time, but you don't have mental capacity. And this is leading to a lot of people who have never even experienced things like imposter syndrome or anxiety to be experiencing those feelings and emotions in that mental state. And they're not quite sure what to do about it, how to understand it. And that's why we brought on people who actually have professional experience in this concept, besides me who just experiences it. Maybe you guys can shine some lights for our friends on kind of all the social media is our only outlet right now, how to kind of combat and work around some of these imposter syndrome concepts that we have going on.
If I could quickly just go back to say something about our current COVID context, and then maybe Eric could answer your question directly. One of the interesting things I hope people pay attention to in the situation that we're in is time is not the issue. In other words, when we live our daily lives and time feels scarce, we feel like we're making all our individual choices and our life is playing out because of that. And that's a pretty typical individualist American narrative about who we are and how we do what we do, right? The thing is, moments like this make it clear how many other factors have to be in place in your world every day for you to be you. even though we live in a culture that makes us believe that the main causal factor in who we are is choices we made in our frontal cortex. Life has been on this planet well before our frontal cortex evolved, and all the stuff with those living systems is in what we are. I hope that one of the things we take out of this culturally is to recognize how truly interdependent we are with each other, as well as the cultural space we've created, and then we can be a little more understanding of the plights of others and not condemn them so much on this notion of you made these individual choices that are making you be in this bad space. So I really hope we pay attention to that. Only 20% of the world lives the way we do. And that's Europe and the United States. And the rest of the world sees itself as much more interconnected with context. They see themselves as constituted by their relationships with their family, as opposed to me being me, and then that's just a relationship I have. So I really hope that kind of way of talking and thinking comes to the fore and, dare I say, starts to have a bit of an impact on our political situation. And I'll stop there.
No, that is an amazing point. And I do think that more and more people are seeing the value of community and relationships when we are suddenly forced to not be able to have those in-person things. Those things that we took for granted that we didn't realize that we needed so much.
Exactly.
I never would have said before that I need conventions, but I do.
Eric, do we say that to each other?
Yeah.
You do? Exactly.
I mean, so that actually gets very much into my wheelhouse. That my expertise are on belonging and social connection and social exclusion and the needs that are satisfied by social interactions. And so, yeah, I mean, cons, fandom are very much a part of that. Now, we can get some of it virtually, right? That has its own pitfalls, as you alluded to. But at the same time, as we've been doing virtual panels, it's not the same. Right. I mean, it has the benefits that anyone can watch any panel anytime, and you don't have to choose between the 3 panels that are going at the same time. You just stream when you want. But you don't have that time to just shoot the breeze with someone over, coffee or a fermented beverage or something like that. Don't have the thrill of the hunt as you're rifling through this long box of comics or whatever your accoutrement of choices. So we do miss some of that, and some of it is social, some of it is just internal.
There's a lot of sensory experiences that go with physically being in the moment that, we're all a little deprived of right now. And you miss that feedback because it's like being one removed. We've done a couple live shows on Twitch, and you feel like one step removed from your audience because they're not there. You're not getting their reactions in real time. And it's missing something,
Yeah, it's missing a lot of the personal component. Like Elle said, if we're doing a show live, like we can see facial expressions, we can see immediate auditory reactions. And in a situation like Twitch, we're deprived of all of that.
I call them the little adventures, right? So Eric and I were in San Diego, not this summer, of course, the previous summer for the whole week, basically. And we went to a Ray Harryhausen panel. Of course, he's passed. It was representatives of his institute. He's the guy who did all the Dynavision stop motion monsters. So they gave a talk, and I was thrilled to be there, like a 12-year-old sitting in the front row. And then this young man gets up and he says, hey, I'm a dancer. And one of the things I like to do is to pop and lock like a Ray Harryhausen creature. And the guy sits there and dances for everybody. It was just the best, right? And then I caught up with him outside. When it was over, I caught up with him and I asked him if he would dance for me so I could get a film of it on my camera. Just those little spontaneous adventures that are, can happen at a con, but can't happen in daily life because no one's going to pop and lock Ray Harryhausen monsters at work, right? But if I go to...
I might.
All right, y'all heard it here. Eric's going to do a pop and lock for us. You know who you're around. And so the spontaneous things that happen are just going to be the things that you kind of love. For example, getting up in the morning and going to see the world premiere of Scooby-Doo Zombie Island 2. I mean, you never do that in daily life around here, but at the con, you have that opportunity. And those little adventures, essential to feeling fresh, feeling alive, feeling dynamic. And when you can't have that, then someone at a loss.
That makes me think of an adventure we had when we went to Colossal Con last year, where we were purposefully sneaking around the hotel to go a different way to our friend's room.
Well,
just because we could. We weren't
Because we
drunk.
could.
We just wanted
Because
to.
we could.
We were off on a secret mission.
Yes.
And were you cosplaying at the time?
I don't think we were.
I don't think so. I think we had just changed.
We had gone and gotten our Kalahari chalices filled.
But which we hadn't drank.
We hadn't drank them yet. And we decided that we wanted to go on a secret mission back to the hotel.
See, that's what a con will do to you, right? The hotel becomes a dungeon.
Well, and now we're all trying to replace that with social media, which obviously is not the same.
No, it's very, very much curated. The image that people are putting out is one that they want you to see. You know, the flaws are not there. And then some of those flaws are important because if, you know, something happens live and you all have a good laugh together, right? Because everybody's been there, right? There's a amount of grace, I think, that people are more likely to afford each other in person. I'm looking at a screen. I don't see the other person. So, you know, I'm going to say something horrible on their feed because I'm not going to see their reaction, right? It's almost like I'm just writing a diary, except that diary is kind of public.
There's a few of those out there, basically, that are diaries that are public.
Eric,
well, and I've also noticed with our community, because obviously a lot of people have lost their jobs in this pandemic process, that suddenly people are trying to make cosplay into a monetary value, which is also causing a lot of stress for a lot of people that we know. I mean, even those of us that aren't doing monetary are trying to compare ourselves to the cosplayers that literally it is their job. They have all day to make videos and tutorials, and that imposter syndrome kicks in because you're like, I'm not doing enough because there isn't anything else to do right now but social media. So you feel very boxed in. The people you're comparing yourselves to are the people that are able to do it full time.
I'm probably going to talk a lot about context today, just because why on God's earth would our culture's most on the edge creative types have to struggle? In other words, there's no reason why we don't have a living wage in this culture. There's a way to organize how we're all together, where instead of condemning people for not having money, we could be celebrating the creativity we unleash by supporting people. No one's talking to anybody that way, by the way, right? This culture is just not talking about how can we unleash our creativity unless it's to make a buck. I would argue that's very dangerous, and I think we've seen the results of that the past 40 years. So I'm not going to give political sermons and such, but when people are out there suffering by themselves, trying to think about what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? I would want them to understand that that is not the only way to think about the situation that we're in right now, but it is the way we have been culturalized to experience ourselves in this moment. Right. And that just makes things worse.
Well, and I think another important topic that you just kind of touched on very briefly is the way that our culture happens to look at the arts in terms of their monetary value. One of the things we've noticed right now, especially, is that people are looking to the arts as some form of escapism or entertainment because there's nothing else that they can really do if you're staying at home and social distancing and not having that social interaction. A lot of people are turning to either movies, theater, recordings, novels, physical art, YouTube, podcasts, to all those sorts of creative outlets as a way to kind of escape the situation that they're in. But as a culture, for a very long time, we've kind of ignored that as a type of career path that we think that people deserve a living wage in, which I think is unfortunate. So, because so many people are expected to do things for exposure, or just because, well, you're a creative type, so you should want to do this, without putting into all the years and hours of training and practice and all the failures that lead up to the finished product.
I'll say one thing. Once the species figured out how to keep that fire going all night, and then carry it with you to go somewhere else, and then carry it with you to, once we figured out how to do that, creativity paid for itself for the rest of our species' existence, right? So the idea that somehow every creative individual has to prove their worth to the culture is the exact opposite of, I would argue, how we should be conceptualizing it. Creativity is what we are. It's how we got out of the swamp into the condo. And we need to be able to effectively address and respectably address the constraints facing 21st century human culture. We've got to unleash creativity. Eric and I work at universities, and they're almost the last bastion of paid creativity, in the sense that students go there and they're exposed to things they will not be exposed to in another place in their life when they're gone. And it's an opportunity to maximize your own openness, be exposed to things you won't be exposed to. And that's just not the way we're talking about it anymore. We're defunding the arts in the K through 12 world, forcing them to somehow prove their financial value. This is the exact opposite of what will work.
At least classically, in Western culture, the way that Renaissance, et cetera, looked at university was this exposure to various different perspectives. The liberal arts, philosophy, sciences, all of that. The idea of being a Renaissance scholar means that, you're perhaps a jack of all trades, but master of none, right? But you can think broadly. Listen to NPR sometimes when they're interviewing people from liberal arts institutions, and there's always the discussion of, how do you justify your existence because, are you placing people or, in jobs or whatever?
We have imposter syndrome.
Well, and what I've always appreciated in those interviews is that the point that the representative of institution is always making is that when they go out to job fairs, for example, people who are hiring, want transferable skills. They want innovation, right? They're thinking outside the box. What the hell does that mean? Well, it means that enough, you could make connections across different boxes. I'm going to start mixing my metaphors here. Have to be able to stop and say, hey, this thing I learned in my art class, makes me think about this thing I learned in my chemistry class. The people who are expertise in those areas have been so siloed that I don't know if they can't make that connection. They're not used to thinking that way, right? So I love being able to teach, pop culture narratives in my classes because it's not something that the students are used to, and they may never pick up a comic book again or whatever, but they've had that experience to go beyond, I've memorized this definition, I know how to pick it out of a lineup, and that's all they learned.
The concept liberal arts actually means to liberate one from the dogma of common sense. So basically, when you go to a university, you are developing uncommon sense. We are seeing the competition between common and uncommon sense in our culture right now. I just want to say that's what liberal arts means, is to liberate one from dogma, but the dogma of common sense, the stories we tend to develop in ways that aren't checked, that universities are set up to check. You guys have got the energy, you've got the creativity, and if old people like me could just get the policy set up to unleash it, I think we'd be in a different place.
Yeah, it's kind of like trying to constantly climb a ladder that continues to grow and you never quite get to the top. That's kind of how I always think of it. And I've had some other people explain that both in regular life and in cosplay, where like you feel like, because it's particularly with cosplay, there's so many of you that you feel like you constantly have to keep trying to prove yourself and prove your worth as a cosplayer to be like worthy of your hobby, which when you think about it doesn't make any sense because it's a hobby. Ideally, unless you're trying to monotonize it, which is becoming a very common thing in cosplay, and that's a very American thing, where we feel like we need to monotonize everything because it's not good enough unless we're making money off of it. We get that question a lot where we don't, right, as of this episode, we don't have a Patreon, we don't sell merch, we're not, we might do it at some point, but we have no plan on making this our full-time job. We say that all the time. This is not our full-time job. This is something that we do. And a lot of people are like, why do you spend time doing this podcast when you're not making any money off of it? Well, the point isn't to monotonize it, but because we're told that for something to be worth something, you have to get money for it, that becomes a very common question for us.
But when asked, why are you doing it? Like my first response in my mind, because I've been asked that too, why I'm writing on psychology and comics or teaching it? And my response is, because I can and I like it.
Exactly.
Right? Now, I also do want to recognize that that's part of my privilege, right? That I am in a situation socioeconomically, even within my particular job, there are plenty of psychology departments where not only would this not be valued, but it might actually go against me. And I'm very privileged that I'm in a situation, and I'm not just saying that because my boss is here.
This thing with social media, and social media, obviously, Ash and I are old enough that it has not been part of our lives forever. We aren't as attached to likes and comments and things as the 20-something generation that is behind us. And I know that right now, with that being the only social outlet, I'm seeing a lot of what you're talking about, like with competing, but with posting, where they're doing these very specific posts and doing these very certain things just to get the responses. And then when they don't, they get very upset, and then they feel like they failed, or that they're not worth anything because their post isn't getting hundreds of likes. And like, I've had it happen every once in a while myself, even, where you start getting a little concerned, like, oh, are these cons that booked us for guesting going to want to keep booking us if we're not still getting likes on Instagram? Because, you know, there are still some conventions that base whether or not you're allowed to guest and how many Instagram followers you have, which the algorithm, come on. That's like the big source of the imposter syndrome right now, is fighting the social media algorithms. And then feeling like you're failing because the algorithms are failing, and then you might be doing fine, but if you're basing what you're putting out creativity on what types of social media feedback you're getting, you're just going to end up in this awful circle that is going to make you go down and down and down and down further. And I mean, Instagram their algorithm is atrocious. Like, everybody got to chill with Instagram. It's now like Facebook, where you don't reach anybody. But so everyone's trying to find the new thing is the TikTok, which we don't understand because we're too old. But the new thing is the TikTok. So now everybody feels like they have to have video setups in their houses to keep up with the social media trends to be worthy of continuing to cosplay. It's a little mind-boggling for me, being a little bit older, that it's not something that has always been in my life. But I'm seeing a lot of the stress in our younger community members. They're in a tough spot, our early 20 to mid 20s, where they probably just started working. They don't have all the time that the teenagers have to make videos and things of that nature. Stressing out that their momentum in the community is going to fall because they can't keep up with the trend, because the trend is now based on how much of that time do you have at home and how much mental capacity do you have to keep up with the specific trend. There are some people who have a lot of mental capacity and time, and then there's a lot of us that don't. It's like you can almost feel the stress in people's stories. The apologies. There's so many apologies in stories. I'm sorry I haven't put out a new post. I'm sorry that I haven't done a new video. I'm sorry that I'm not posting work in progress. I had done that at one point, and then at one point I made a post and went, I'm not going to be sorry, because what am I sorry for? This is my hobby, and I have to live my life, and it will do what it does when it does. That's part of the reason we're on hiatus right now, is we both went, this is not enjoyable right now. We need a break, because what is the point of doing it if you're not enjoying it?
So you said something earlier that I've been sort of perseverating on. So I didn't know much about imposter syndrome before this. Like, I knew the colloquially, so I decided, most of my expertise is I know how to delve into research and read it and figure it out. So I gave myself a crash course on imposter syndrome research. Earlier you mentioned this isn't your career, right? This is just a hobby. So why do you still feel it? That seemed to be the question you asked. And looking through the literature, most of the work on imposter syndrome sort of assumes it's in the career domain. But I don't think it has to be exclusively that. I think the bigger part is that it involves a domain that's core to your self-concept. We can have hobbies that we kind of enjoy casually, and then we can have hobbies that we might consider ourselves fans of. right? And when you take that step, it moves closer to how you define yourself, right? It's not the only way you define yourself, right? But it's a big part of it. Even if you're not making money off something, I'm saying you, I don't mean you specifically, I'm using the colloquial you now.
I mean you specifically, Elle, but
I mean, this all applies to me. Let's be perfectly honest. This is fascinating. Please go on.
Well, but I mean, it's I use you too because I feel it myself in various ways, and that's what I think is interesting about the literature is whether it's talking about a job or what I'm thinking is just something that's core to yourself. It is something that we all can feel to some degree. Some of us may feel it more regularly than others. Some of it may only feel it in a certain context. Right. But this is why I've seen some people sort of try to avoid using the word syndrome because it sort of, as Scott mentioned earlier, it sort of pathologizes or clinicalizes it. I think I just created a word there.
Awesome, dude.
Thank you. But it is something that we struggle with.
This concept that we call identity, looking at how the brain works in terms of in relation to who we think we are, who we believe ourselves to be. I have this phrase I've used for about 10 years. It's called identity follows circumstance. And what that means is in order for you to feel yourself to be someone, that someone has to have happened many, many, many times. Just like when you learned to walk, your body had to incorporate gravity and your own mass into how your brain and muscles were coordinated. And they only work now because it's unconscious. Put yourself in an unpredictable environment, for example, an uneven staircase, and you can't use that unconscious stuff anymore because it's predicting the regularities you've lived through. So what that means is that your memories are constantly providing a background for your experience of whatever moment you're in. For me, imposter syndrome is this idea that your unconscious assumptions about who you are have not caught up with the actual successes that you have experienced. And we can never predict what about our experience is going to become who we are. We talked earlier about all these little adventures that happen at cosplays that we don't often experience as motivators for why we go. All of these things that happen as we do something become part of what we expect later, and it becomes part of who we think we are. If you look generationally at the impact of COVID, you two have extensive experience being with people at cons. When you were hit with the COVID world, your identity as cosplayers, you believed yourself unconsciously to be cosplayers because you had done it over and over and over, right? Younger people haven't had that yet. So when they got thrown into COVID, they don't have this rich wealth of identity about being a cosplayer that they can bring to the fore when they're looking at all those likes on social media. And for them, their identity about being cosplayers is being mediated by these two-dimensional images. They don't get to hang out and go out and have a beer later. They don't get to have those little adventures that you guys have that's all wrapped up in what it means to be a cosplayer. So therefore, they're very vulnerable because they don't have the wealth of experience that the two of you have. I think we're seeing right now, and I guess I started with this earlier, we're seeing right now how much we're dependent on the context we're in to sustain a certain identity. And these young people who are trying to develop young adult identities in this non-adult space is just extremely difficult because there's nothing but the likes. There's nothing but the words. When you're at a con and you sit there and have a conversation with someone, the two of you, your bodies start to resonate. In other words, you take turns talking to each other, you laugh, all kinds of complex things happen that just can't happen on Zoom or Skype. They can't bring that to their memories, right? They don't have that there. So you guys are much more immune to the kind of stresses they might be experiencing. And the only advice I could give them is the same advice I give anybody who tries to parse out an identity based on popularity. It's a trap because you end up not being yourself. You end up being what the public likes. Well, you already said earlier, I stopped thinking that way. That therefore makes you less immune to that stress. Now, we all like to be liked, and we like the likes. You know, my maximum likes on a Facebook post usually, if I have a good one, it's maybe 36. When I get that 36 like post, it's cool, right? So we like that stuff. At the same time, at my age and with my life of experience, I'm not as vulnerable to the stresses caused by selection or deselection or inclusion or exclusion in those media. It's not that I mean, I'm vulnerable to it, but there's this whole world of experience I bring to it. The younger people, unfortunately, they just don't have the opportunity to, because they don't understand, because our culture doesn't understand that who we become is about everything we're in. All of that becomes activated when we're thinking about it and when we're in the moment. And so your experiences in the end are going to help, flesh out who you are later on. And if they're at home setting up video studios, I mean, some of the stuff I've seen is basically professional modeling. I mean, these unbelievably sophisticated photographs that they sat there and shot for hours to get just the right angle. And then they photoshopped the hell out of it when it was done. This level of production, it's a different thing than sewing something together, going to a place and being with other people who are wearing costumes. It's almost bordering on professional modeling. Mm-hmm. That's never a space you want to compete, because then you really become a slave to the most basic aspects of the human condition. And I'll stop there.
Well, and I'm curious for like you had mentioned, and like Eric had mentioned earlier, when we were talking about social media posts and how you're only putting out what you actually want people to see in those situations. I'm curious to see how the community as a whole is going to react to some of these personas that people have created on social media once we are finally able to get back into kind of the norm of what we're used to being the norm before COVID, where we get to see people in person and deal with them on a regular basis, and how the identities that people have created on social media are going to relate to the identities that kind of evolve as they're put back into interpersonal relationships one-on-one socially. And I think a lot of what you were talking about as far as, us being a little bit more immune and having kind of those freedoms, it's very similar to us not making this our full-time job. Like, we don't rely on what other people or sponsors or patrons or what have you want as far as content goes. We are not slaves to what the money would dictate. So we're able to have a little bit more creative freedom in terms of, these are the topics that we think are important, and these are the topics that we want to talk about, without having to worry about, oh, well, are we going to get funded for this?
No, Eric and I do the same thing do you get a grant or not? And in a lot of universities, you can't get tenured if you don't get external grants, which means that your research gets dictated by what the funding agency thinks is important. And one thing that I've worked very hard in my department to do since I've been chair for over a decade is to increase what I call intellectual diversity, and to have everybody appreciate each other as creative scholars. You got to publish in peer-reviewed work. Your work has to be examined by the public experts. To try to create one of those as being better than the other is actually anti-evolutionary. It's anti-diversity. And it's kind of arrogant if you actually think you know what the best thing is. That's not how keeping fire came to be. So the money is actually a constraint. It's not freedom.
Well, and I think there's a lot to be said about something that you have passion in, talking about or creating in or researching something that you're interested in. There's a lot to be said about what the final product quality-wise is going to be, if it's something you're passionate about versus something that you're just kind of assigned. I think most recently, I don't know if you guys have followed the information about Tonester from TikTok, the paint mixer who got fired from his old job.
Mm-mm.
Yes.
He's got over 1 million followers on TikTok because of these paint mixing videos, and he got fired from his place of employment for it. Somebody recognized that passion and creativity that he had and actually recruited him into their paint company instead. So now they've got this very passionate and dedicated employee who already has a very high social media following, who is only going to benefit their business.
Your discussion of, or your point about how being in the pandemic and sort of that restricting our interactions to just this sort of curated, polished virtual space it takes a lot of our basic human needs, whether we grew up with social media or whether we've kind of aged into it. It kind of forces us to be less complex in terms of the way that we exist, and the way that we get our needs met. For those of us, in this virtual space here, who didn't grow up with social media, right? We have various ways that we get interpersonal validation, right? And social connection, whether it be through our jobs or our friend circles or whatever. Now we're all kind of deprived of that, right? So where we previously might have thought of ourself in different spheres as being somewhat complex, we have to get all of that validation in a very narrow channel, right? And if you're starting to mix it now with not just, I want someone to say they like what I did, because that makes me feel good, but I also have to get some money out of it, and this is the only way that I can get that. Which, whereas, before now, you might have gotten compliments on your costumes just idiosyncratically walking by someone. Now you only get it in this format. And people behave differently digitally than they do in person for a lot of reasons. I'll say I think it's very, very dangerous because we're being forced to be less complex. I hope that we can bounce back.
Well, that we'll adapt. Whatever context throws our way, short of famine and nuclear war, we'll move forward. Whatever, but the forward is not what we know. No one knows what forward means. So I agree with you on that.
It'll definitely be an adventure when things start to slowly go back, but they're never going to go back to what they were before because you can't duplicate. I mean, after this kind of an event, things are going to change. That's just how it works. Like, you've been changed by your environment and what has been occurring. So I'm interested to see what convention culture looks like when it returns, and what parts of some of this social media focus sticks and what parts of it start to kind of float off, and what the new quote unquote normal for the cosplayer kind of looks like once we start having a hybrid of in-person and online. I think we'll have kind of an interesting, I don't even know. I mean, I'm sure it's going to be interesting. I just don't have any idea what it's going to look like.
I think you're going to see the emergence of digital platforms for different con structures, Ace Comic Con, Wizard Con, creating subscriptions, producing content year-round that's available virtually. And what's really, really cool about that is that annual get-together will mean that much more. Eric and I, we went to WizardCon I went for the first time in 2015. I went there for the weekend. We had fun. We came home, and I didn't have any WizardCon thoughts in my mind until I went to the next WizardCon. That's going to change. With this content I know they're going to create, and I know means Scott's predicting, you're going to get the community is going to expand to an annual, continuous monthly virtual content distribution, whatever, like TV shows, by the way. And then when you come then to that annual event, you're going to have this whole monthly experience or the content experience of those people virtually that is just going to amplify, I think, the fun people have at the annual event. The unleashing of creativity that's going to happen is going to be something we've not seen. So we're all in a crap situation right now, and I think it's going to be rather glorious when we get out of it. It's going to be different. For me, I'm totally into this virtual con stuff. I don't know when you guys started your podcast. I started
2 weeks before everything shut down for the pandemic.
Yeah. And now,
literally, like, we did C2E2, which was like the broadcast of our podcast starting, and then 2 weeks later, everything shut down.
Yeah, and after a year or two of doing this will be part of your identity as cosplayers, right?
Absolutely.
And this, so that's part of how it's all going to change. I myself love this stuff. I had started Dark Loops last March for a professional organization known as the Society for Mind Matter Research, and I was going to do a podcast where I'd call in scientists and philosophers, and we talk about sci-fi movies. And then it just became what it is because I could do it, as Eric said earlier. And I just love these conversations. And The highest number of watches anything that I've done have received is maybe 100 and some. At the same time, you know, when I do like you doing in your podcast, I want that long drawn out second glass of wine after dinner conversation, right? That's what I want to have, because I think that's a lost art in our culture. And I want people to have the opportunity to listen to that. Now, if people, I've had people say, well, YouTube's only about 17 minutes, this or that. And it's like, well, no, YouTube might seem to you like it's about that, right? Because that's what you're looking for. But I'm putting something out there, and for the people that might want something different. And it keeps me going, provides a new way for me to be Scott Jordan. So COVID sucks. At the same time, once we learned how to keep that fire going, creativity paid for itself. And you guys are probably experiencing yourself a little bit differently these days because you've got this podcast thing. That's just what we do. We keep reinventing ourselves. That's what it takes. Otherwise, we just get buried.
Yeah, I do think that we're going to see a lot more of the virtual stuff going forward, like you had mentioned. There were only a handful of cons that did the virtual ticket previously, but I would expect to see a lot more conventions now that they've realized they can technologically handle doing virtual content to go ahead and have that extra like subscription service where maybe their main events is broadcast over the internet for anybody in the world to come and enjoy this little piece of their con while it's happening for the people that are able to attend in person.
Yeah, we saw the evolution of the con this last summer. I'm not going to say any names because I like to participate in all of them, but
yes,
one con, really, really well-known con, Eric and I did a panel with Wakanda Forever, the psychology of Black Panther. And this con put their very recognizable logo on our video and let the world watch it for free. So not only do we have now the street cred of having their logo on one of our videos, 4,200 people across the world have watched that video. That would have never happened at a con. We would have gone up. Yep. There would have been people in the room. I think Eric and I have maxed out at 150, no, maybe 300, maybe. And that's it. And it's gone and there's no record. That was, for me, that was brilliant on their part because the whole thing then was nothing but a goodwill commercial, right?
Yep.
Then there's another con that put all that stuff behind paywalls that elicits a different vibe in the consumer, right? And it doesn't come across as a goodwill gesture. And then there's another con series that basically developing this distributing content every once in a while vibe that for free, but you have to pay for photos and personal interviews. And I think that's another brilliant take. The freeness, it's a commercial, man. Okay, just get your commercial out there. And so we're seeing that evolution take place right now. For this evolution to be taking place so clearly right in front of us is, right? It's just not going to stop because we've all been pent up in our homes doing this kind of thing for so long. So I'm really looking forward to getting back.
Ain't no party like a con party.
It's true. I mean, I don't know if you guys have not gone to Colossal Con, you should, because that's literally all it is.
Sounds like fun. Sounds like a colossal blast.
I'm going to guess when this comes out, which will probably be about March, we probably haven't quite returned to the con scene. In the meantime, what advice would you want to give to cosplayers to kind of working their way through this difficult time with, am I doing enough? Am I not doing enough? And kind of combating with social media a little bit.
I'll just say one thing and then I'll stop. You have to be aware of your ambition. You have to sit down and you have to ask yourself, what are you going to be upset if you don't have? What are you going to be upset about if you don't have it? And then you have to look at everything that goes on when you're getting that and ask you, oh, so am I going to be upset if I'm not sewing? Am I going to be upset if I'm not meeting my friends? In other words, what, because that'll tell you what you really want. And I think once you can become a bit insightful about what you want, then you've got another frame to put it in when you're suffering, when you don't get it. But if you don't bring it to consciousness, if you don't become aware of what you want, then all you do is suffer when you don't get it. I don't think ambition is something we can get rid of. Ambition is like love. You're not in control of it. So recognize as a part of you that you don't control, and it's your passion. Try to become cognitively aware of what it is And I'm not saying get rid of it, but don't lie to yourself with platitudes like, oh, I really don't care if I win. What a bunch of crap. We all care if we win.
We all care.
Exactly. So don't do that to yourself. Be honest with yourself. And that allows you to be honest with things that you might call failure. But when you call that failure, you're totally devalue the adventure, right? So try to do as much as you can. You just dig the adventure. Invalidating the struggle is the surest way to just constant misery.
I'll add to, in addition to being honest with yourself, be kind to yourself and recognize that what you are seeing everyone else, quote unquote, do, but once again, very curated.
Also add that you may not have the experience to deal with right now. Like I said, you guys have a lot of experience that you can bring to the moment, and you guys turned it into a podcast. And I have to admit, I'm doing the same thing with Dark Loops, right? There's a part of my life that I want to keep going. So instead of waiting around to be invited to all these things, I create this space and not being upset when I don't, when my likes don't compete with YouTube reactions. I'm not going to, it's just not going to happen. Give yourself, Eric said, be kind to yourself. Hopefully we'll have a culture in the coming years that'll spend a little more time talking about how we all really are related to each other, connected to each other, and everything that happens is part of who we are. So we can be a little kinder to not just each other, but the world and the way we think about the world. And okay, I said I wasn't going to say anything.
I remembered my thread.
Oh, good.
Which in some ways is channel Scott anyway, because I'm pretty sure this is something he said to me or something that emerged out of our various beer conversations. The word should is funny, right? So earlier in the podcast, you talked about what people are being told they should be doing or they should be focusing on or whatever. And when someone tells you what you should be doing, they're really telling you what they think is important, what they should be doing, and putting that on you. And if that's not what you want to do, don't let them come into your brain and tell you what should is, because that's their values, their identity, right? And so if you want to just have this as passion, hobby, right, and you don't want to make money off it, then don't, right? Don't feel like you have to unless it's something that you are honest with yourself that you want, to bring it back to what Scott said.
No, Eric, you make a very good point. Why are they telling you what you should do? Because they need you to be a certain person so they can be who they think they're supposed to be. Mm. But then why when they tell you what you should do, why does that matter to you? So what we do is we say, oh, I don't care what they say, and she doth protest too much. Of course you do. That's why you said anything in the first place. This is most intense probably in families, right? These are relationships that we just never can get out of because they're in us. And mom, leave me alone. Why do you always judge me, right? Well, why do you care that your mom's judging you? The neighbor judges you all the time and you don't care. So recognize that dependence and don't beat yourself up because you are dependent on people. That our culture just beats the hell out of us because being dependent on people is weak. And this is precisely the way of thinking about human beings that has gotten us to where we are in this culture. Don't spend time, as Eric said, saying should, right, wrong. Just ask yourself why.
Just processing all the things. This has been a fascinating conversation.
This is a very fascinating conversation. Definitely. Thank you so much for joining us.
It makes me miss graduate school. I don't think I've had this stimulating of a conversation in at least 3 years. So thank you for that.
Thank you for inviting us, and we very much appreciate chatting with you guys.
Well, and maybe when we could do this in person again, we could do this in person.
We will definitely hang out and we'll argue about the third season of Titan. Absolutely.
Let's do it. Yes, because we will hopefully see you guys at Planet FunkCon.
I've yet to go to FunkCon. I have to go. Eric's been there. I haven't. So
it's a good time. Because I know before it got canceled, I know Eric had asked if I was available for a panel. I think you were going to have me play Harley, weren't you, for a panel?
That was going to be, I think, at a QuadCon.
Oh, it was at QuadCon. That's right.
I was giving a Joker talk there as well.
That's right.
But no, whenever FunkCon does happen again, I think I've been sort of in conversation with them, and I think we'll be able to figure out at least one panel, if not maybe more. As soon as I hear from them, we'll talk a little bit more about
yeah, sure. Yeah, I know. I signed our contract. We have a contract.
Weird.
What?
You got a FunkCon contract?
A Funk Con contract.
You
Yes.
should frame that, man. That's pretty cool.
Right? Well, would you like to tell our friends again where they can find you if they would like to hear more about your research and your different talks that you give?
Definitely find both of us on the Illinois State University's Department of Psychology homepage. You can also find some of our podcasts as the WGLT Site Geeks at wglt.org. And I think just Google, search Site Geeks there. And then I've got that blog called Film Culture. That's through the Normal Theater. So you Google that. And then, there's that Sterling's Popular Culture Psychology series, edited by Travis Langley, that we contribute to.
All the places Eric mentioned, you can find me. You can also find me on Dark Loops Productions channel on YouTube. Basically, what we do is podcasts regarding live life, the arts, the sciences, and all things pop culture. They're long podcasts. They're not short. Also, there's a thing we're doing at Illinois State University called ReggieCon, con that asks the question, what's your story? And basically, we do monthly virtual con panels focusing on a particular comic or graphic novel that celebrates diversity and inclusion. So, so far, we did Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba's Day Tripper, the Midnight Angels to celebrate LGBTQ month. And then we have four panels coming up in spring. You can find that at Illinois State /ReggieCon, or just type in ReggieCon in Google. And those are free, open to the public. And we do our best to answer all the questions that come up while we're online. So,
and I'll make sure that if you guys send me any links, I'll post them again in our notes so that our friends can click the links and hang out. Although I think I'm going to have to check out ReggieCon because that sounds pretty fun.
Oh, very cool. Thank you.
See what musings you come up with for different topics and things.
You get four nerds together and you're just going to have fun,
Well, yeah, obviously.
That's fun.
Which is also the whole point in the end.
Yeah. And it's also a really, really cool thing about contemporary culture is the nerds won. It really is a dominant force in culture right now. And what I love about it is that it's a culture devoted to inclusivity, diversity, and creativity. So I'm in 100%.
Thank you again so much for joining us. Hopefully we can have you both back in the future for another wonderful conversation. You wanna close us out, Ash?
Yeah. Again, I'm Ash.
I'm Al.
We are Lavi Cosplay.
And this is Shit Cosplayers Say.
You've been listening to Shit Cosplayers Say, an LVC production. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Podcast SCS. Our website is lavicosplay.com. Have a fun, crazy con or cosplay-related story, absurd cosplay question, or just something in general to share with us? Email us at podcastscs@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, just because you can doesn't mean you should.